Imagine this. It is 1986. A young South African crosses the border under the cover of darkness. Behind him are police raids, arbitrary arrests, racial segregation, and the brutality of apartheid. Ahead lies uncertainty. He has no wealth, no passport that guarantees safety, no certainty about tomorrow. Yet, as he arrives in a neighboring African country, something remarkable happens. He is welcomed, not because he is rich, not because he belongs to the same tribe, not because he is a citizen. He is welcomed because he is African. That simple act of humanity became one of the greatest stories of solidarity in modern history. Now fast forward to today. The same continent that once sheltered South Africans now watches heartbreaking scenes of fellow Africans chased through the streets, businesses looted, homes burnt, and families forced to flee from violence in South Africa. Zimbabweans, Somalis, Mozambicans, Nigerians, Ethiopians, Congolese, not by foreign occupiers, but by fellow Africans. And perhaps the most painful question we must ask is this: have we forgotten? South Africa has every right to confront unemployment, crime, inequality, corruption, and pressure on public services. These are genuine challenges. Millions of South Africans struggle every single day. But hardship may explain frustration, it can never justify hatred. Political scientist Lauren Landau argues that xenophobia in South Africa cannot simply be explained by economics. Migrants often become convenient scapegoats for deeper structural failures. Failures of governance, inequality, and economic exclusion. Similarly, anthropologist Francis Nyamjo reminds us that societies struggling with identity and belonging often direct fear toward outsiders instead of confronting the systems responsible for inequality. But perhaps no thinker understood this danger more profoundly than Frantz Fanon. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon argued that colonialism does not only occupy land, it inverts the mind. It teaches the oppressed to see themselves and others through hierarchies of fear, exclusion, and inferiority. In The Wretched of the Earth, he warned that when liberation fails to deliver justice, the frustrations of ordinary people can easily be redirected away from oppressive structures and toward those who are even more vulnerable. The immigrant did not create apartheid. The refugee did not design economic inequality. The Somali shopkeeper did not write racist laws. The Nigerian entrepreneur did not steal anyone's future. The Zimbabwean laborer did not invent unemployment. The enemy has never been the African next door. The enemy has always been injustice. Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe takes Fanon's argument even further. He argues that colonialism leaves behind systems of exclusion that survive long after independence. Unless societies consciously reject those habits of division, they begin reproducing internally the same forms of violence that colonial powers once imposed upon them. In other words, a nation may become politically free, yet remain psychologically imprisoned. That is why xenophobia is not merely violence against foreigners. It is unfinished business. History makes this tragedy even harder to understand. Because South Africa did not defeat apartheid alone, Africa stood beside her. When apartheid isolated Pretoria, Zambia welcomed liberation movements despite repeated military attacks. Tanzania trained freedom fighters under Julius Nyerere. Mozambique sacrificed lives while sheltering members of the liberation struggle. Angola became a battlefield partly because it refused to abandon South Africa's liberation movements. Nigeria donated millions of dollars to the anti-apartheid struggle, funded scholarships for South African students, and became known by many as, in brackets, the frontline state without borders. Across the continent, Families opened their homes, mosques and churches prayed, workers marched, students raised money, artists sang for freedom, governments accepted refugees. Africa believed that apartheid against one African was an attack on all Africans. Former President Nelson Mandela never forgot this. Following his release from prison, Mandela traveled across Africa, expressing gratitude to the nations that had sacrificed so much for South Africa's freedom. He understood something simple. Freedom was never won alone. It was carried on African shoulders. Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe spent his life reminding Africa of the importance of reclaiming its own humanity after colonialism. His writings challenged Africans to reject narratives that devalued African lives and identities. That challenge remains relevant today. What story will Africa tell future generations? If Africans become the hunters of fellow Africans, what history will our children inherit if liberation gives way to exclusion? Then comes perhaps Africa's greatest gift to the world. Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Ubuntu. I am because we are. Archbishop Desmond Tutu described Ubuntu as the understanding that our humanity is bound together, that none of us can flourish while another suffers. Fanon believed genuine liberation required restoring human dignity. Mbembe argues that decolonization remains incomplete wherever exclusion persists. Ubuntu says our humanity is shared. Different scholars, different generations, yet they point toward the same truth. No African becomes more human by treating another African as less human. This conversation is not an attack on South Africans. Far from it. Millions of South Africans reject xenophobia. Many have risked their own lives protecting migrant neighbors during outbreaks of violence. Mosques, churches, community leaders, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens. They remind us that compassion still lives within South Africa. Violent mobs should never define an entire nation, but neither should silence excuse violence. Patriotism should never require hostility toward fellow Africans. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: xenophobia weakens everyone. Businesses close, communities become divided, investment declines, tourism suffers, fear replaces trust. The dream of African integration, as foreseen by Muammar Gaddafi, becomes even more distant. Borders become psychological walls, and everyone loses. So what lesson should we learn? First, history matters. Nations, like people, should never forget those who stood beside them during their darkest moments. Second, as Fanon warned, unresolved injustice often turns the oppressed against one another instead of against the systems responsible for their suffering. We must refuse that trap. Third, governments must solve unemployment, inequality, and crime through sound policies, not by allowing migrants to become convenient scapegoats. Fourth, Pan-Africanism must become more than speeches delivered at African Union summits. It must be visible in the taxi ranks. It must be visible when one is ordering an Uber, in schools, neighborhoods, marketplaces, and in how Africans welcome one another. Fifth, Ubuntu must be practiced, not merely celebrated. Compassion that ends at the border is not Ubuntu. Perhaps one day another generation will look back at this chapter of African history. We will ask whether we remembered Zambia, Tanzania, Mozambique, Angola, Nigeria, and every African nation that stood beside South Africa when apartheid sought to isolate her. They will ask whether we honored that sacrifice or forgot it. Mandela challenged us to protect freedom. Fanon challenged us to free the mind. Mbembe challenges us to complete the unfinished work of decolonization. Achebe reminds us that history remembers the stories civilizations choose to write. South Africa, What do you choose to write? The next chapter of Africa's story is ours. May it be written with gratitude instead of resentment, with solidarity instead of suspicion, with Ubuntu instead of hatred. Because before we are South Africans, before we are Nigerians, even before we are Zimbabweans, or before we are Somalis, before we are Ethiopians, and before we are Congolese, we are all Africans. And no African should ever become a foreigner in Africa. Thank you for watching, and like, share and subscribe to my channel, and see you in the next one. God bless you.